Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Crowd Conversations, a monthly virtual speaker series in which we in New York State call on our colleagues from across the US and beyond to share their expertise and advice about building a circular construction economy with deconstruction and building material reuse as important components in the paradigm shift from a linear to a circular economy. I'm Gretchen Worth. I am the project director of the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning, which helps New York State communities plan for more equitable, climate resilient built environment. The Christopherson Center is one of the founding partners of CROWD, which stands for Circularity, Reuse, Zero Waste Development, and we're an organizer of CROWD Conversations. I'm pleased to welcome tonight's speakers, all from Tompkins County, Diane Cohen, Felix Heisel, and Gideon Stone, with Christine O'Malley moderating. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping details. We value your time, especially on a Monday evening, so we will keep this conversation to an hour, including the Q&A. So please type your questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll get to them at the end. We're also recording the session, and we'll share that out to all who have registered for tonight's event. And we'd appreciate if you can keep yourselves muted so that everyone can hear the presentation. And for future planning, our next crowd conversation will be March 6th with Steph Compton of Energy Justice Network, who is going to share Baltimore's progress in adopting a deconstruction ordinance. And you can register for this session at crowd.org. For those of you who aren't familiar with CROWD, we are a network of partners who came together in 2020 to work toward a more sustainable built environment in New York State. We are planners, architects, preservationists, university faculty and students, and our numbers are growing with people from across New York State. CROWD is working to create a circular construction economy in New York State that brings environmental, economic, and social benefit to all of our communities. At the core of our efforts, we support and advocate for deconstruction and building material reuse rather than the demolition of buildings and infrastructure and the creation of vast amounts of landfill waste. We work on local and state policies and practices, research and analysis, education and community engagement, and equitable workforce development. You can get more information about us on our website, crowd.org, crowd with a zero for zero waste development. You can learn about our partners and their work, register for upcoming CROWD events, sign up for our mailing list, download resource guides, and reach out for more information. Since we're coming to you tonight from Ithaca, New York, I'd like to acknowledge that Ithaca is on the traditional homelands of the Guyakahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Guyakahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on the land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guyakahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guyakahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. I'd also like to now introduce our moderator for this evening, Christine O'Malley. Christine leads Historic Ithaca's efforts in education, advocacy, and community engagement, and consults with home and property owners, businesses, city and county government officials, and educators. She has worked on local designations of properties and National Register nominations and has published essays and articles on various topics related to the history of architecture in North America. As part of Historic Ithaca's work with CROWD, she participates in efforts to promote salvage, deconstruction, and sustainability in our community. So Christine, over to you. Thank you.
In January 2022, 11 residential structures originating from the year 1910 were planned for demolition as the result of the proposed Catherine Commons project in College Town in Ithaca. This is a development of 300 new housing units. With the help of experts from the Bellingham, Washington-based Building Deconstruction Institute, the group was able to convince the developer to deconstruct instead of demolish one of the structures, led by community partners Finger Lakes Reuse and Trade Design Build. So today we're going to hear about this case study from our speakers, Diane Cohen, Executive Director of Finger Lakes Reuse, a nonprofit organization founded in 2007 to help transform waste into community value. And she's been working in used material management since 2001. Now operating 2 community reuse centers, employing more than 80 people and paying a living wage, Finger Lakes Reuse is working with various multi-sector partners to design and demonstrate a more effective materials management system for reusable and repairable materials to remain in the local economy. We'll also hear from Felix Heisel, an architect and academic working towards the systematic redesign of the built environment as a material depot of endless use and reconfiguration. Felix is an assistant professor and the director of the Circular Construction Lab at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning. And he's also a faculty fellow at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. He's published numerous books and articles on this topic, and most recently he published Building Better, Less, Different, Circular Construction and Circular Economy. And Gideon Stone is a founding member of Trade Design Build, a local architectural general contracting and fabrication firm, which was founded in 2016. After graduating from Cornell in 2009 with a degree in architecture, he chose to stay in Ithaca, where he worked for an architectural and contracting not-for-profit organization before starting his own company in 2012. Throughout his career, he's worked to bridge the gap between design and construction to better understand the process of bringing sustainable structures through to built form. So we have a really great presentation from our three speakers, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gretchen, for setting the stage. Thank you, Christine, for the introduction. And thank you, Crowd, for the ongoing partnership. I'm going to start us off today, but we'll do this very collaboratively as we did this project. And essentially, the three of us are here to represent a big group of partners that were helping to realize this project, as was just laid out. I wanted to lead us off with a couple of facts and statistics to sort of understand with the kind of framework or the conditions that this project was developed within. And so if you look at the kind of influence of building and construction over the whole life cycle of buildings, so from the production all the way till the end of use, then our industry is responsible for more than 50% of resources that are taken out of the environment, out of the Earth's crust. Roughly 40% of carbon dioxide emissions and more than 40% of solid waste that is being generated. And it's worth looking at, especially the carbon emissions, a little bit more in detail. And if we were to aim for the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that was agreed at the COP in Paris in 2000, what is it now? 15, I think, 16. We would need to flip the curve that we've been running for the past 100 years, essentially, which is an exponential curve that goes up in terms of carbon emissions and had just started to slow down now. And if we flip that and mirror it, then we essentially have the target, which means a reduction in carbon emissions by 65% in the next, let's say, 7 years. 6-7 years, which is immense, and it's an immense undertaking considering the size of our industry, the timelines that are associated with the construction of a building, for example. And so we really have our work cut out. But if you look at these numbers in again a bit more detail, then we know that part of it comes from the operation of buildings. So all the energy that's produced to run a building, to heat a building, to run our computers, et cetera, et cetera. And the other percentage, and in this case, it's globally, it's 11%, come from the production of materials and the construction of these houses themselves. But this isn't the whole story, because if we now change the time scale of this operation and we look at only the next 10 years, then these numbers shift dramatically, because operational carbon emissions are emissions that are emitted little by little, year after year, over the timeline of a whole building, which is 70 plus years, ideally 500, right? But if we only look at the next 7 years, the time that it takes to reduce our emissions by 65% dramatically, right? Then the embodied carbon emissions, which are emissions that are emitted on day one of a building's opening, right? They've all been emitted already because they were produced in the production of that house. Then they take on 74 or even more % of that pie chart. And so the real question, if we want to make swift and rapid change, we need to change the way we build, and we need to change the way we source our materials, and reuse is the most sustainable way to do so. And so within this framework, we looked locally at Ithaca, trying to understand the conditions and the capacity of and kind of economic system of implementing something like this within the local system, utilizing this case study that Christine laid out already. And so what you see here right now is an aerial shot of these 11 buildings that were demolished in January of 2022. And we were tasked with, or we were able to deconstruct one of these 11 houses, but within a very strict setting of it cannot take longer than the demolition of the other 11 houses is taking. And so that meant we have roughly a week to deconstruct this building, which meant we needed to shift from a traditional technique of unbuilding the house element by element to what we call a panelized deconstruction. And so essentially that meant we carved large pieces, cut large pieces out of this house and then lifted them on a flatbed and brought these elements to a warehouse to then be processed offsite, which has also many advantages because you have a controlled environment that you're working in. You have a better control of the materials and their material flows. And the developer has a clean site much quicker. We essentially were done after 5 days with a house of 4,500 square foot and 13 bedrooms. And here you see a couple of impressions how this looks like. This is the gable being cut out and lifted down. This is a floorboard, the panel of the floor lifted off, and then this is at the end of day 5 the stack of material down at Finger Lake Reuse's REDOT site. And with this stack of material, I want to hand it over as a kind of mediator and the sort of the revolving point of this conversation to Diane to talk about Finger Lake's reuse.
Thanks, Felix, and thanks, Gretchen and Christine. It's an honor to be here. I love Crowd. It has taken the work that I've been doing for many years to a whole new level, to a much higher level. Really grateful for all the advocacy and energy and focus, and super exciting. So I'm just going to tell you very briefly about Finger Lakes Reuse, which is a nonprofit organization that, as Christine said, we were founded in 2007. We have a triple bottom line mission to enhance community, economy, and environment through reuse. And that's a very broad kind of intangible thing. So we, out of the gate, we started these with these goals to reduce waste, relieve poverty, and teach job skills through reuse. And our vision is of a just, resilient, and waste-free world that values people and resources. Go ahead, Felix, thank you. Tompkins County was our founding partner. They wanted a reuse center. They had it in their long-term plan. And so we decided after doing some research that a 501c3 was the mechanism to get going with. And I got very fortunate to be in the lead of this planning project and ultimately the executive director. We opened our first reuse center in 2008 on the left there and in a strip mall called Trip Hammer Marketplace. We've doubled in size twice up there over the last 15 years. And in 2015, we also purchased a 17,000 square foot Ithaca Reuse Center. So in total, we've got about 45,000 square feet of retail and processing area, plus the warehouse space that we're going to talk about. We don't just handle building materials, although that was my first driving thing. I also recognized that was a really important material that was underserved, but we did furniture and household goods when we started. And over the years, we added in computers and electronics because of the e-waste issues, and then clothing and shoes and books and media as well. And we're a certified living wage employer, very proud to say that. We've been you know, we handle a bunch of different materials. We've been growing, and we've been averaging about 20% retail growth annually over the last 10 years. Next slide. Sold around 750,000 items last year. And we've really been struggling with capacity. That's been kind of a regular theme throughout our growth throughout the whole 15 years, but particularly with COVID, rising consciousness, climate crisis, the economy, more people are bringing us material than ever. So there's 185% increase in donation drop-offs. That's individuals bringing us, you know, it could be a U-Haul, it could be, you know, one thing. But that's a count that we have that's pretty solid data. We've, during COVID, we also lost a really important volunteer base. So we've had to keep our workers safe and to try to manage things. We've been increasing our staffing. So we've increased that by about 144%. And like I said, 20% increase in sales over 5 years is 100% increase. So our revenues aren't quite keeping up with our expenses as we've been growing, and that's been a challenge. Next slide. So this green line is our earned revenues. So it's not just retail sales, it's also fees that we charge. We do a little bit of wholesaling of overflow into secondary markets, but the growth has been pretty strong. Even with COVID, when we closed for a few months, we have continued to kind of drive up that growth. We did about $2.5 million last year. Click again, please. And the gold line on the bottom, that's the contributed revenues. That's grants, donations, private foundations. And that has been more kind of moderately growing, although it has been growing. The support for what we're doing, the recognition has been increasing. The bump in 2020 and 2021 was PPP loans that got converted into grants. This year we're projecting that our business revenues will cover about 88% of our expenses. Next slide. So we do, besides having these 2 reuse centers, which are pretty busy, just those, we have a deconstruction and salvage service. We do very little whole house deconstruction now because our intake is saturated with what the public is bringing us. So that's a capacity issue. We also refurbish computers. We have a job training program. Last year we gave, I think, close to $90,000 worth of our inventory away through other human service partners who submit applications on behalf of their clients. We also have an Ithaca Fixers Collective. So every Saturday at our Trip Hammer location from 3 to 5 p.m., you can bring in anything that needs to be repaired, and there are volunteers who will help you work through repairing your project. And that photo is, we had a couple of really popular kids fix events, and I just think that kind of exemplifies why reuse is so special and engaging. There's tools, there's focus, you know, you're using your mind, you're using your hands to solve problems. You can do it collaboratively. And then coming soon, we've got a big fabric project with a community quilting center. Go ahead. One partner I was really excited to engage for this College Town project was the labor union. And the guy on the left, Casey, at the time was their training coordinator. And more recently, he's now become the president of Local Laborers 785. And he spoke on behalf of Finger Lakes Reuse when we were trying to get some public funding. And he said that this project, well, he thought it was really nice and he was super enthusiastic. They actually pulled up thousands of square foot of oak flooring for us with their training program at no charge to us in pretty cold, unforgiving weather around the holidays. He said that the more he thought about it, the more he realized he was really transformed by this project and recognized how important reuse is and is excited to be a partner moving forward, which is just, I think, super exciting for the industry to get the laborers involved. Next slide. We had more than 50 volunteers show up in pretty bitter cold weather, doing kind of bucket brigades of flooring that had been pulled up to load it out. It was thousands and thousands of square feet of flooring out of these 10 houses. And then the house that we deconstructed was all paid labor just to keep the insurance satisfied and make sure that we had a clear distinction. So we had volunteers working in the salvage projects, and then where the structural demolition was, that was all paid and insured workforce. Next slide. So we scrambled to rent a warehouse, knowing this project was coming and a huge volume of really nice, beautiful, dry, valuable wood was coming. So here's the forklift bringing some of the material in. Go ahead. And then as soon as we got the warehouse, we had other space needs as well. So there was a shared space. All those pallets in the background are electronics, household items. There's clothing in there. And about a third of the warehouse we dedicated to these building materials that were coming from College Town. Next slide. Here's a bunch of the materials in there. Next slide. And then, you know, I think that was September, we had everything in that warehouse plus another 130 plus pallets of material under tarps outside. Just so much material was coming at us last year. Each year it's more and more. And we just always try to figure out how to manage this volume of quality materials. Next slide. So we really didn't have the workforce to pay to process these materials. So we've used all volunteer labor, denailing these thousands of square feet of flooring, using the space to do so. And next slide. Community members, college students, next slide. I think, yep. And this slide shows, we have them stack them vertically along the wall so that you can kind of bundle them by similar length. So that's what they're doing there. Next slide. Yep, this was a fraternity that volunteered on a Saturday morning. Next slide. I think these were Cornell athletes. Next slide. Yeah, and this is my last slide. You know, people ask, you know, what's the market? There is a market. We kind of demonstrate that every day if it's an accessible price. These were cabinets. They weren't the greatest cabinets, but they came out of one of the houses. And I took this photo because we had just set them up that morning and those are all sold tags. We estimate that we harvested about $25,000 our price. That's in our warehouse, could be a little bit more. And I know Historic Ithaca was in salvaging quite a bit as well out of the houses. So haven't gotten the data on that yet, but it was a great community project and an exciting way to engage people. And thanks, that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Diane. I'll jump in and talk a little bit about the Circular Construction Lab and our interest in this project and the learnings from that project moving forward. And so just a couple of words about the Circular Construction Lab. We're a research unit at Cornell University that really focuses on kind of the implementation of the circular economy into the built environment, into an industrialized construction industry. And our focus goes two ways. On the one hand side, we're looking at all the buildings that have been built already and trying to understand how we can activate those as a resource for future construction, which is what we're talking about today. But then equally important for us is the question, how can we build now, from now on differently, so that the houses that we're constructing right now are designed for disassembly and take all the lessons learned from the struggles that we have at the moment into consideration, so that the buildings that we build now will not turn into a toxic dump landfill in 50 years or 100 years or hopefully 500 years down the road when they reach the end of their service time. And it's a big effort of many people, and I'm just the one representing, and I'm glad enough to speak about it. But I want to shout out to my students that have been a phenomenal part of this research. And so the interest that the Circular Construction Lab has in these projects are going into many different directions. On the one hand side, we're trying to figure out what is a technology that answers the question, what is a building made out of, if we have no idea what it is made out of? Because a building that was built in 1900 or 1906 usually doesn't have documentation that is more than a thick black line if we have archive drawings, but we do not know what is the detail, what is actually the material in the wall behind that plaster board. And so what we're developing here is a kind of scanning software that gives us very quick estimates of the content of a building based on material family, based on embodied carbon values. Once you walk through the building, and essentially activates a technology called LiDAR, which is now available to most of us with the phones that we have in our pockets, and so that the technology readiness level is quite low, and the sort of the technical and the financial limitations of using a software like that are limited. And so we see a big chance of kind of bringing the understanding of the material content into this conversation as a starting point. The second point that we're interested in this research project is in understanding what is salvageable. And so in the example that we've just looked at, everything on the right side, it was salvaged through this deconstruction effort. But there are several other material families that we didn't touch or that we couldn't touch due to regulations. For example, the asphalt shingles in New York State, New York, you're not allowed to recycle those. This is something that might have looked different in a different state or a different context. We also weren't able to recycle or reuse any of the concrete due to the setting of that specific project, which is also something that really needs to be investigated much more deeply. And there are first ideas of how reuse with concrete could look like. Then, of course, we're interested in the market value, but this is really sort of Diane's field. We're increasingly interested in what workforce development looks like, how we can develop trainings, how we can kind of collect the knowledge that comes out of these projects into information that is that can be passed on, that can be communicated, and how would that work as an educational facility? That is one of our interests, and it is something that we're doing within the community, within kind of skill training, but more importantly also with our students. So these are examples from a deconstruction workshop that we just conducted in when was it, September of last year, a different building where students really had a chance firsthand, hands-on, to experience salvage and deconstruction, pull nails, de-nail flooring, understand the kind of complexity and difficulty that this process brings to the table. But I think there's a more important learning curve in this, because if you've tried to take apart something that wasn't meant to be taken apart, and you've tried really hard and put in all your labor and force, you're not going to go back to the drawing table and draw something that doesn't work to deconstruct, right? And so by learning this the hard way, I think there is an interesting design lesson to be taken away from that as well. And so we're really interested in these kind of hands-on workshops. And then the kind of last component of this is to implement the materials that we salvaged into a design project. This is a little installation that is currently still standing on the Arts Quad at Cornell University, which is made entirely of timber that was salvaged from this case study project. And our interest in that was, on the one side, of course, understand the resource, kind of quantify the resource, also specify the wood, the strength of the wood, do an engineering study on how to build something that is structural and something that needs a building permit from salvaged timber, but then also how to design something that is working with a non-standardized resource, because none of these timber beams have the same dimensions, for example. And so how does that change the process of reassembling a structure like that? And of course, that also involves a kind of documentation. So how do we build material passports? How do we attach these material passports? How do we tag the physical and the digital? And how do we keep track of these resources so that we can then reuse them in yet another application down the road? And I'm extremely proud to be showing you this slide, because we finally last week published Rhino Circular, which is a software tool for Rhino and Grasshopper, which allows a direct feedback on design decisions regarding the circularity of a design. And it's free for download now at Food for Rhino. And I'm really interested what you guys are going to do with that, and listen to your feedback. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gideon Stone.
All right. Thanks, Felix. Yeah, Gretchen, Christine, thanks for having us. And again, thanks to the crowd. It's really exciting to be able to have an opportunity to be involved in a project like this from the standpoint of being involved in the design and build industry. I studied architecture up at Cornell and was on a project group there for the Solar Decathlon. And one of the biggest complaints that we as the students had during that whole process was that we had tradesmen and folks in the community that we could probably learn a lot from, but there wasn't an opportunity to be able to engage with those people that were out in the world kind of doing design and building work on the daily. So now that I've kind of gone out into my professional career and have started my company here in Ithaca, to have this kind of an opportunity to work with a nonprofit and a research group from Cornell collaboratively on something like this, it was a really exciting opportunity for us as a company to be able to kind of dip a toe into really kind of wrapping our heads around something that I think traditionally has not been part of the conversation in the work that we do as a design build firm. Large in part because there's not a lot of money available for taking the time and the energy to be able to slowly deconstruct buildings and figure out how to utilize the materials that are embedded in these older projects and these older houses and structures, both residential and commercial. So, just kind of contextually for me, I started out back in, I think it was 2012 was my first independent project. And, I was doing a bar design up at Agava in East Hill Plaza here in Ithaca. And I, had this idea to buy a bunch of barn boards and barnwood because it was kind of a, trendy thing that was going on at the time. But philosophically, it made a lot of sense to me to be able to utilize old salvaged materials. It brings a lot of kind of character and beauty to a product in a space that you can't get with materials, and there's obviously just a lot of embedded sustainability and sense to it. And this is usually what you're dealing with this kind of a process, is that you go in, you take the time, you pull a building apart, and you end up with this pile of materials that you have a lot of embedded labor that needs to be invested to be able to kind of convert it into something that's utilizable for something. And large in part, it's mostly just used for aesthetic purposes, for reworking it and turning it into a nice finish. Felix, you can go to the next slide for me. So this was that first bar that I did at Agava here in Ithaca. You can see I made a bunch of boxes with old barn boards, and it was really just kind of utilizing old materials again to create aesthetics. So for me, the really exciting part of this conversation that's going on between my company, Reuse, and the Circular Construction Lab is really starting to kind of pose the question, in the context of Crowd's work with moving forward deconstruction legislation, hopefully, and that effort, but to really understand what it takes in a practical sense in the real world applications of these kinds of approaches to deconstruction. How do we actually roll up our sleeves and develop markets and develop design thoughts and design processes that can actually implement these things in real world ways, where we can bring them to clients and hopefully in parallel be able to develop not only a stronger deconstruction market and process, but then also kind of convince design firms and builders to be able to kind of utilize these things in a meaningful way to be able to incorporate them into projects. So Felix, if you go to the next slide. This is another example. We did the watershed down next to the State Theater, which was a beautiful historic building that actually housed Ithaca's first operator center for the first phone system that got put in back in 1905. And what you're seeing here is we went through, and there was an old oak floor that was installed on the main floor of the space. We pulled all that up. Again, we milled it all up, we processed it. So that's all of the natural wood that we used for this kind of lattice patchwork. The blue boards are some siding boards that I pulled off a house the summer before we did this project. And then the white boards were a bunch of subflooring boards that we pulled out of the basement. And actually, on one of them, we found one of the carpenter's signatures with a date on it from 1905. So it was pretty cool. But again, right now, large in part, any of the reclaimed or reused materials that we're using in our process is really aesthetics. And it's not to say it's a bad thing. It's great. It creates a really nice kind of look and feel to things. But it's really exciting to kind of start wrapping our heads around how we can expand upon that. Felix, you can keep rolling. So part of the collaboration kind of role that we've played with this is, to whatever extent they can, they've tried to pull some money together to hire some of our carpenters, and put them to work taking some of these materials and helping out with the construction effort. So we contracted with Felix to do a little bit of the assembly work with the boards and some of the material we pulled out of the house on Catherine Street. And these are just some of the shots of us kind of going through. We cut all the components to length, labeled everything, and then we set up this whole process for assembling some of these components that were then kind of given back to the student group, and they did the final assembly on the art squad. So Felix, you can go to the next one. It's just another shot of some of those components being assembled, getting ready for delivery. And again, this is just another shot of that pavilion that Felix showed you pictures of earlier, which if any of you are in town or in the area and have a chance to get up there and see it, it's pretty spectacular. It's a really nice installation. And then, so one of the other kind of concepts that we're looking at that's really interesting is this idea of being able to take this fabric, this panelization process of deconstruction, and limit the amount of effort that needs to go into taking the actual independent components apart and be able to just panelize the structure itself and see if there's a way that we can reuse some of these panels. So, what you're seeing here is that gable end being cut off, and, we're having initial conversations and just kicking ideas around. Hopefully we're going to be able to find some clients that'll invest in a bit of an R&D process, and, we can convince somebody to let us build them a house or a cabin or something like that. But Felix, if you go to the next slide for me, the idea of being able to take some of those panels and do some small structures like this, or even, single bedroom residence or something like that, is kind of just one example of the many opportunities that we've got to be able to kind of move this whole market and this process forward in a practical way. And that's just scratching the surface on, a bunch of the other avenues that are being taken with this, which are, I'm sure some of you have seen. There's, monolithic compressed plastic blocks that are getting produced now. I forget the company's name, but they're basically taking, secondary waste products and trying to kind of get creative and, turn things into building materials that are going to hopefully enable us to help embed some more carbon and just kind of tap into reusing materials and waste in a way that's hopefully going to turn into a much more equitable and practical way to move forward, as opposed to just taking our old buildings and putting them in the trash. So I think that's the last slide I've got, and I'm going to pass it back over to Felix.
I saw that this is one of the questions in the chat, and so we wanted to point out that, of course, all of these efforts and many more, right, the efforts of Crowd and all of its partners are trying to have a better understanding, and then from that better understanding develop policy and policy change. And so this is just a slide from a template ordinance that Crowd is working on for deconstruction in upstate New York, specifically this one geared towards Ithaca. And I think this is sort of the underlying nominator for all of these projects that is trying to figure out how can we scale this question in construction, in deconstruction, in design, in architecture and engineering. And I think that's also the question that we can sort of bring forward in conversations like the Crowd conversations. And with that, we would be very interested in your questions and feedbacks and comments, and kind of open the floor, and I pass it back to Christine.
Great, thank you so much. Lots of interesting questions coming in. I think one up at the top was about age requirements and about the whole certification process, or what's needed for deconstruction and how to go about it. So I'm wondering if you could just speak about that and about the training. I know you mentioned the workforce development piece of it, but also about deconstruction in terms of the actual certifications required for it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, OSHA training is a really like important and critical part of it. But that just covers general job site and construction site safety and industry safety. It's not just construction specific, but we brought Dave Bennick in. I forget the name of his organization out in Oregon. He's up
Deconstruction
in,
Institute.
yeah, so he's up in Washington State, and he's done, I want to say, thousands of buildings that he's taken apart. And honestly, that's helpful, and it's really something that if you're planning on getting into this or have a structure that you're looking to get taken apart, it's not a very specific skill set other than having some construction experience and working with a contractor or a demolition contractor that understands building structures and can come up with a viable plan to be able to move through. Time's one of the biggest kind of considerations. The situation we were up against, it had to come down very quickly, so we had to move towards the panelization. But if the client who's paying to have structure taken down has the capacity to slow things down, and you're able to get people in and really slowly pick it apart, that's definitely another option. But as far as any specific certification or training or anything, there's nothing deconstruction specific out there. I don't think, at least. Felix, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Because of the nature of the using tools, we say 18 and up. We don't allow youth to work with power tools. We have worked with the youth training programs to do hand denailing, and if the person who asked that question is working with youth and wants to talk offline, I'm happy to do that. We had some successful middle school age programs denailing, but they did it by hand, and we never have any volunteers at height. We keep everybody on the ground level to process materials. So in a structural setting, we like to have trained people only working where you're taking down walls, etc.
No, I think that's crucial. But maybe to add to this, it is a bit of a question of the jurisdiction. Portland, Oregon, for example, has a list of 17 certified deconstruction companies that are doing the deconstruction within the kind of setup that their deconstruction ordinance provides. And Build Reuse has a list of kind of certificates for deconstruction on their website. So there's a couple of resources that you can follow up on to see that there is a sort of a starting point for a national certificate for deconstruction that will hopefully become more important as we speak.
Yeah, New York's a bad example of that too, because we do, some municipalities require electrical and plumbing licenses to be carried by contractors, but I've talked to some folks who are general contractors in other states, and there's actual licenses and certifications that you need. So yeah, Felix, I think you're right. It's definitely a state by state kind of circumstance, so that depending on where you're at, it's just something that you should look into with your local building department.
Great. And another question, someone was asking specifically Diane about reuse marketing the flooring, or has it found a market already? And I think this also ties into another question that someone was asking about the materials. Has the development of affordable housing been under consideration for the materials? So really a question about where these materials are going and how they're being marketed.
Yeah, so I meant to mention that. So I'm glad that someone asked. We have not sold the bulk of the materials yet. They're still warehoused. We are still doing the final kind of packaging of them. There were, if you imagine 11 houses with, at least 10 rooms in each one, and there's different wood on the second floor than there is on the first floor. There was a huge variety of wood, and we wanted to get through all of the flooring before we started selling it, so that we had kind of lots of things, like similar lots. And so we're hoping to have an early spring sale, maybe even as soon as March. And we're trying to figure out if we can do that on the site where the warehouse is, because I'm not quite clear if we can do a one-day sale there or not. But that's what our plan is. And when we do sell it, it'll be widely advertised.
And I will say, because it did come up in the chat from Kat about the soft stripping of the properties. So there was a lot of soft stripping that went on in the other houses that were coming down. So not just the one that was getting deconstructed. So a whole lot of 5-panel wood doors went to various locations at Finger Lakes Reuse and Historic Ithaca. And we have, put that into our door inventory and are, regularly selling that along with the hardware that came out of the houses from the doors, etc. There was another question here about abatement. I think it's good to talk about this, about what kind of obstacles you face with lead or asbestos abatement.
I always like to say with asbestos, it's the same as demolition. In theory, it's supposed to be abated prior. We have definitely discovered jobs where it's certified as abated, but we still see that there's, oops, they missed this piece. So so when we've gone in to do deconstruction, we protect our workers with the masks that will handle asbestos fibers, just because it's certified as abated. There's also other airborne issues in the air for our workers, so we want to keep them as safe as possible. There's molds, there's all sorts of things. With lead, we also just assume, and then we have warnings in our retail outlets that we assume that things may contain lead, and so please use caution. If you're even buying a piece of furniture could have lead on it. So if you're going to send things airborne. So I think, I'm not sure if it's still on our sales receipts, but we have signage and warnings. So we do sell things with lead. If there is flaking lead paint and it's just like exploding off of an item, we typically throw that in the dumpster.
It's another, oh, go ahead.
Maybe just to add to this, because I think there is an interesting lesson learned from these projects, especially kind of the way Dave Benning looked at these. He actually preferred a building that was abated over one that wasn't, because the abatement process helps degut the building, which is one of the most labor-intensive parts of deconstruction. And so if you find if you have the abatement team go through the building and take off all the plaster because there might be something in the plaster, the deconstruction afterwards is much easier because you have access to the building. You can see where the structural beam, how do I take this building apart so that it's safely deconstructed. And so I guess that the kind of back and forth between the abatement process and the deconstruction process is actually potentially much closer than we might think. And maybe one of the benefits of deconstruction is also that you are able to find these contaminants, versus in a demolition process, especially if it's an in situ demolition and you just hose the thing down, the contaminant level for the environment, for the neighbors, you might just blow up some of these asbestos fibers into the air and they float into the neighbor's window that is open. So I think that deconstruction has a lot of benefits in contaminant control because you're more careful and you're more controlled in that process.
Right, that's an important point. There's another question, I think maybe directed toward Gideon perhaps, or all of you, wondering if you have any thoughts of how to utilize salvage materials in a traditional design build scenario where product specifications are the key to the process.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's, my gut is that it would, especially right now, be a very limited, it's a little cost prohibitive to get into that process. The availability of a variety of different types of materials and just the lack of consistent access to things not to tout our business model, but working with a design build outfit or doing design build process is probably going to be a much easier route. Once you start getting into circumstances where you have to go through the design bid build process, my gut is that it's just so cost prohibitive to be able to say, I mean, you might be able to get away with some sort of a timber frame structure, but then you fold in the need to be able to get somebody to stamp or sign off on the structural integrity of the components. It just you start getting into situations, I think, where the nuance and the willingness for contractors, owners, and designers to be able to have the flexibility and the willingness to roll up your sleeves and go through that kind of an assessment process, it just doesn't lend itself well to the design bid build process, in my mind. You're asking for more headache than I think you're going to want to deal with.
Maybe to build on this, moving forward, I mean, the question is, why is it such a headache, right? And so one of the problems is that we don't have the right documentation about these materials. So the implementation, for example, of material passports moving forward would then give us exactly this information that by the time we deconstruct a building, we could say, okay, we know exactly what it is. We know how it's put into the building. We know how it's possible to deconstruct it without having any structural damage to it. We know if this building was in an earthquake in the meantime. We know if it was in a fire or if anything else has changed the structural integrity of that piece of whatever it is, equipment, steel, timber, right?
Yeah.
And so with that sort of chain of custody, essentially, right, of that material, we could then move directly into the planning process because we know that this material fulfills the bid and the specifications required in the bid. And so the documentation of the built environment is an essential key to close that loop moving forward. The other part is code and policy. There are now 3 states in the US that changed their requirements on regrading timber for structural reuse, at least in specific applications. But for example, for a single family home, you can, in Washington or in Portland, you can directly reuse timber that is salvaged from deconstruction projects and put them into a structural application. And the trust essentially is put into the hand of the contractor and the structural engineer. And I think that's the right way to go, because those are the experts. They have their hands on the materials. And they know where it comes from. They are ideally the ones that took it out of the building. And so I think there are ways how policy and a sort of a new way of documenting building materials can move this into a possible future.
Yeah, and I think that's the critical piece, right? Is that I don't think, at least in this area, in my experience, in this process so far, a lot of those things are not established here, but this is the exciting part of this conversation and this work that's going on right now, is to be able to identify these things and start to kind of bring everybody up to speed with these nuanced new types of processes and approaches that make a lot of sense from a practical standpoint. It's just actually getting buy-in from everybody and kind of lifting this up to a level of being normal. So
yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And I see that really ties in with Justin's question from Big Reuse. He says, how could the state government help support deconstruction? Is it investment through NYSERDA or Empire State Development or statewide policy? What are your feelings about the best way forward for example, for New York State?
I think recognizing the workforce development, both needs and opportunities in the field of deconstruction and reuse, and that's starting to happen a little bit. I think New York State is kind of watching what we've been doing and other communities. So I think that workforce piece is key. I know that there's what Crowd has been doing to push. Here are some examples of what other communities are doing and raising awareness and educating decision makers about that is great. So having the policy is key. And then I always like to say, I think more investment in the kind of brick and mortar opportunities for the material to flow through is really another thing that's absolutely essential, because we're demonstrating in Tompkins County, a county of 105,000 people, which includes about 30,000 students, that the 45,000 square feet of retail space we have is just bursting at the seams, and there could be more. And we're just a few blocks away from historic Ithaca Significant Elements program, and they've got building materials, and so there's more opportunity for more of these materials to flow.
Definitely. Yeah. There was another question about the concrete. So someone was asking, aside from reusing, they're wondering how you deal with concrete foundations. Is the concrete granulate reused? And I know in this particular project, you didn't take it out. You noted that, but if you want to comment at all about concrete and what can be done.
I know typically in the industry, the deconstruction contractors tend to bid down to the foundation, and then they either subcontract or find someone else to handle the concrete. Concrete is very recyclable. So, and there are, I don't personally have a sense, but maybe Felix or Gideon does, of how much actual concrete is being recycled. A lot of times they want to just use it for fill on the site. But that's what I know, is that typically we go down to that point and then let the heavier equipment come in and handle that.
I mean, if you look at concrete from a circular economy perspective, then I have a very torn relationship with that conversation, because the definition of the circular economy asks for a highest utility and value in closing the loop. And grinding down a structural and actually quite impressive material into granulate and then put it underneath a road, for me, doesn't fulfill highest utility and value. And so this is all downcycling, and it's not recycling, and it's definitely not reuse. And so I think there are certain categories that we need to look at in terms of concrete. The best example, I guess, would be reuse, which means we cut pieces, or we actually reuse the foundations in place and build on top of those again, if that is possible. And it requires probably a large headache to make that work. But the question is that maybe worth it? Are there different ways of actually reusing part of the foundations? At least in this specific project, they were not taken out because they were necessary as retaining walls and for flood control because of the steepness of the site. So that actually was a sort of a beneficial aspect, that the concrete, even after the existence of the house, the concrete had a role to play in that specific location. And so at least not all of it was taken out. On the other hand, the concrete that was taken out was landfilled directly, and there was no reuse involved. And that, unfortunately, is in this area of the United States, the status quo. So even though concrete recycling is possible, it is rarely done in these kind of projects.
Mm-hmm. Right. Just noticing the time is 6:31 now. And Gretchen, I don't know if you want to wrap things up, or if we'll just take one last comment or summary.
Go ahead for one last comment summary, and then we'll wrap it up. Thanks.
Okay. So there was in the chat, there was a comment here from Hanson. It says also, I think it's important to note that probably 50% of the potential salvageable materials in old homes are for aesthetics versus structure. So I was wondering how you all felt about that, or if you see that in different situations being not exactly the case. It could be a higher number or lower number.
I think it depends. Like structural stuff needs to be regraded if you want to use it in a structural setting. But right. a lot of material, like plumbing fixtures, can be used as plumbing fixtures, and there's a lot of high function in stuff that's salvaged. So I don't know about the 50-50. Not sure.
Any other thoughts?
I think there is. It varies on a structure to structure basis, I think, where that lands, but I do think it's a good point, in that there's large in part, a lot of these materials are just for aesthetic purposes, and not to downplay that. I mean, I think that there's a lot of value, a lot of beauty, a lot of aesthetic that's worth salvaging, and it's something that you are making an impact. If you're able to reuse the flooring, if you're able to reuse trim, doors, stair treads, things like that, it's just another thing that you're not having to rely on new manufacturers or new resources to be able to recreate these things. So
Yeah.
it's I do think it's a structure to structure basis, but they've all got innate value. So
So lots of great questions tonight, and thank you to our three presenters for presenting this case study. It's a really interesting project, and as Felix noted, it's going to generate a lot of data, inform future research, and there were a lot of practical skills acquired on the site. And I hope that folks are able to join us again next month, March 6th, to hear about Baltimore and their efforts to introduce a deconstruction ordinance. So again, for those of you interested in policy and how these things get implemented, I think that will be a really great conversation. So thanks everybody for your time, and thanks for joining us, and thank you to our wonderful speakers tonight and to Crowd, and have a good evening.
yeah, thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.